Sadly, we have the passing of one of our members to announce. Um, Over the last couple of years, they haven't been attending meetings, but Michael and Janet Caden were members of this group for a long time. And unfortunately, Dr. Michael Caden just passed away a couple of weeks ago. His health had been bad for the last couple of years, so they hadn't been to our meetings for several months before the COVID shutdown. But they were members of this group and also involved with the Pasadena Museum of History for a number of years. And it was actually their involvement with the Pasadena Museum that led to my curating the Civil War exhibit there a few years ago, because they had seen what this group does, and they had seen the work that I did for the museum at one of their historical fundraisers, and thought I might be able to do something to help curate an exhibit there.
Yes,
So Dr. Caden's push got me into doing that. So unfortunately, he passed away 2 weeks ago, but his family has asked that donations in his name be made to us or to the Pasadena Museum of History. And that was very touching, because both of those places were very important to him over the retirement years of his life, which was not really very retired until the last 2 years. He spent over 50 years as a physician, and so involved with Huntington Hospital and various other places. So he was very busy for a long time, but he had a tremendous love of history, especially of the Civil War. So we want to thank his family for mentioning us in the obituary as one of the places to send money. But I personally want to thank the family, because Michael and Janet Caden were responsible for doing some very cool things involving Civil War history in the community. So now I'm going to turn things over to our program chair, Michael Odenino, who is going to tell you a little bit about our speaker for this evening. Michael?
Thank you, Nick. We're very fortunate tonight to have a rock star, literally, as our speaker. I think it's the first and only rock star that we've had on our speaker list. And in fact, Ted Savas was our first speaker. He joined us from Northern California in Pasadena for the very first meeting that we had. I believe someone else has their speaker on and is being heard. I don't know. Anyway, the beautiful auditorium that we are able to use thanks to our president, Nick Smith, at the Pasadena Central Library. Ted was our inaugural speaker when we obtained that venue. So we're very fortunate to have him agree to do a Zoom presentation, or in this case, a GoToMeeting presentation, a remote presentation for our group. Many of you know that he has, for many years, been the premier publisher of Civil War titles in his company, Savas Beatty. Savas Beatty continues to be one of the key fountains of new Civil War books. In fact, I was at the Manassas battlefield a couple of years ago, and their bookstore was full of Savas Beatty titles. And Ted has been responsible for getting many of the books from the emerging Civil War. That group has been wonderfully benefited by the Savas Beatty Publishing Company. And tonight, Ted has promised me that his presentation is going to deliver to each and all of us in exciting new insights into the Civil War. Now, for many of us who have attended many, many meetings over the years, you don't really hear too much about exciting new insights into the Civil War as a whole. You might get little snippets that you hadn't heard about this person or that particular event. But Ted is going to give us tonight some interesting pieces of information that, correct me if I'm wrong, Ted, will change your view of the Civil War. Please welcome Ted Savas. Ted, take it away.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to live up to that, but let me do the best I can. Thanks, Michael. It's really great to be back. And I'll try sharing my screen here in just a second, David. So tonight, I mean, I'm not going to read a paper. I'm not going to do anything like that. What we're going to do is I'm going to just introduce you to someone that I'm pretty sure most of you have either never heard of, or if you've heard of him, you know very little about him. And I'm going to introduce you. We're going to go in about knee deep tonight, and we're going to talk about a few things that he did. We're going to especially focus on some of the early war stuff because I have come across some really bombshell information recently, and it's just changed the way I look at a lot of things in the war and Raines's role in it, and the Union command failures based upon what they knew and what they didn't do. So I'm really excited to share that with you tonight. I'd be happy to stay on as long as you'd like if you have questions. It's never a problem. I enjoy answering the questions, and so I look forward to all that. So David, I'll go ahead and try to share this PowerPoint.
Great.
And I can't tell whether you can see it now or not. I need to hit something, right?
We're not seeing it yet. You should see a screen share option at the bottom of your screen. Are you using a PC or a Mac?
Yeah, it's a PC. I'm just going to share the application window.
Okay, we should be good.
Is that up now?
No, not seeing it yet.
Then let me do the full screen and see how that looks.
You have to click on it and then click on share for that.
Yeah, it's just, there we go. Let's try that. Nope.
Now we got your screen.
Got it?
Okay.
I can't tell how big it is, or can everybody read that all
We're
right?
seeing your PowerPoint. It's right in the middle of the screen. You could actually just go ahead and maximize that and just do
Sure.
the PowerPoint to play on that.
How's that?
That's great. You can bring it up to full size if you want.
Yeah, I think it is.
It's actually just in the window. You've got the play option in there to be able to make it full screen so that it's not showing the slides on the side. We're seeing the slides on the side for this.
Oh, I see. Okay, hold on just a second. And how do I do that? I don't use this too
So
much.
there's down at the very bottom in the lower right, there is a button that looks like a little slide. One to
Okay.
the right, that one. Oops, you went a little too far. It's just the left of the zoom. Nope, just to the left of the zoom. That button right there. Perfect. Yeah,
How's that?
one. That's what we want. There, you got it. Great, thank you.
All right. So let's go back to my first one. All right.
Actually,
I think I'm back to where I was, right?
yeah, you got it out of the full screen. Yeah, just put it on the full screen. There you go. Perfect.
All right. So let's talk about George Raines, and I'm going to introduce you to him a little bit so you can get a kind of a feel for who he is, for who he was, and then I'm going to walk you through his experiences, why it's important, and then get you into the Civil War period. So let's talk about Raines. So Raines was born in North Carolina. Had a fascinating family. His father was from Bermuda. His mother spent time there. They ended up with, I think, 7 or 8 kids in New Bern. A modest a family that grew relatively wealthy by middle-class standards then. His dad was a furniture maker, a cabinet maker. He also ran the local graveyard, which was interesting. And little George used to go with him to the cemetery and bury people and that sort of thing. And that would come in later in the Civil War. I'll tell you a little tidbit on that. But George was a curious, scientifically minded kid from the time he was young. And he went to a local academy with his sisters and one of his brothers. His older brother, by many years, by about 14 years, was Gabriel Raines. Many of you might have heard of Gabriel. Gabriel was the one in the Civil War, became a general, who introduced the use of landmines, or they called them torpedoes then. And so he ran that operation in the Civil War. That was George's brother. So his brother went away very young to West Point, and George didn't know him all that well. But later, when he would come home on leave, George became enthralled by this guy who came home. He was a young lieutenant. He was like a father figure to George. And when the family moved to Alabama, they moved to Linden, Alabama in the mid 1830s. His brother was all the way out in Oklahoma. And so George, at just 15 and a half, traveled all the way out to Fort Gibson in Oklahoma Territory, to visit him all alone, and stayed for about a year. And I mean, he's just 16. Imagine sending your kid out to do that. It was about 600 or 700 miles. And then after a year, he came back. And by that time, he was convinced he wanted to be a soldier. One of the things that's interesting, and it took quite a while to suss through this because there's a lot of correspondence on it, is that Raines tried to get into West Point for 5 years. And he finally got in the 5th year. It was a very confusing application process. A lot of people let him down. There was a crooked congressman involved. There was all kinds of craziness. But eventually Raines got in, and he was in the class of 1842, which was quite a famous class. There were a lot of people in the class you would have known, Longstreet and Rosecrans and many other people. And Raines graduated near the top of his class. He was 5th in his class, and so 3rd in his class, excuse me. And so he went on, and he decided that he was going to go into the engineers, which you could do at the top of the class. And he discovered that he was absolutely bored with engineering. He hated the fact that it was just sort of a mundane use of his time. He didn't like it nearly as much as he thought he would. And he got a transfer into the artillery. Now that's really a demotion because it was almost unheard of at that time. Somewhere along the line, he had met Winfield Scott, and Winfield Scott took a shining to this kid. And Winfield Scott agreed to let him go down into the artillery. He went into the artillery. He went right straight to Fort Monroe. And all of this is going to be really important in just a little bit. So I want you to understand his background because it makes a big difference. Well, at Fort Monroe, Raines decided he didn't like the way things were being done. They wanted to do artillery practice, but he had no artillery experience. They didn't use the guns at West Point. They barely had any information. They didn't let them train. They barely let them shoot. And he wrote a big artillery circular right straight to the Secretary of War and complained. And that, you'll see, it was part of his part of what you will find was his success recipe. Was he wanted to find a way through something or around something or over or under. He never let something stand in the way of blocking him. And so once Raines was there, he made friends with a lot of people that you'll know in the Civil War once we go on with this. And he decided, he really wanted to teach. And he had an opportunity to go to West Point, and he taught geology and science classes at West Point for almost 2 years. And he absolutely loved it. But the problem then was that the Mexican War was starting up. And when the Mexican War is starting up, Raines is thinking, look, there aren't a lot of wars, and I want to participate in the war. I'm a soldier. And so he pulled strings again, and Winfield Scott helped get him down to the border of Mexico, where he ran Port Isabel, which is a big logistics base. So for about 8 months or so, Raines ran a major logistical operation that fed the armies that were moving down into Mexico. Well, that wasn't enough for Raines. He wanted frontline duty. So he ended up being tagged as Gideon Pillow, who we know of Civil War fame. He became Gideon Pillow's staff officer, his chief aide. And he went down with the fleet. He landed at Veracruz, and he was the first American to enter Veracruz because he was really a spy, which is interesting. He took about 15 or 20 Mexican prisoners of war with a couple other guys, went into Veracruz and negotiated their release, studied the fortifications of Veracruz, came back and drew them, and I've got his drawings, drew them and gave them to the ship captains and to Winfield Scott. So they knew exactly what the defenses were at Veracruz because Raines went in there and actually saw them firsthand and sketched them, which is pretty amazing. Well, of course, he landed at Veracruz with everybody. They participated in the siege. He went inland with the army. He ended up fighting at all the inland battles, Cerro Gordo as a chief aide to Gideon Pillow. And then, of course, he went and did Churubusco and into the city and Chapultepec. And there's a 90-page wonderful Mexican War diary that he left. It's just partial, which is sad, but we have all of it. All of that big piece, that 90 pages. And he is extremely detailed, a wonderful writer, a magnificent detailer of events. And he also wrote a 12-page letter to his brother that left magnificent details about all the officers and what they did and his opinions of things. And it was amazing. He saw a lot of action and lost a couple of close friends killed with him in Mexico. Well, when the war ended in Mexico, he went back to garrison duty. And so we're looking in the mid-1840s. And again, he was bored. He went to New York. He went out to Chicago. He went to Mackinac Island in Michigan. He was down in New Orleans. He fought Seminoles for just a short time, but there was no real combat, built roads down there. And he became bored with the Army and frustrated because the bureaucratic, the red tape of the garrison duty and the regular Army just drove him crazy. And we have some of his letters during that time, and he just was very unhappy. Well, somewhere along the line, we don't know how or where exactly, although I think I might have pinned it down about a week ago, they had a meeting in New York City with the Aztec Club, and that was people who were the original officers that served in Mexico. They became members of a club, and they had a meeting in downtown New York. And soon after that, he was head over heels in love with somebody named Frances Josephine Ramsdell. And Ramsdell was from one of the richest families on the East Coast. Her father owned part of the Erie Railroad. He owned shipping all over Lake Erie. He ran different factories. He had sort of a vertical monopoly on a lot of different things. And I can't imagine that he would have been very happy to have one of his two daughters marrying a broke Army officer. And Raines was not only a broke Army officer, he was also the same age as Frances's mother. So he was like 18 years older than the wife he would soon marry. So they got married in 1856, and Ramsdell, it was in upstate New York, lived in Newburgh, and told Raines, "Why don't you quit the service, come on up, and I will put you in charge of the Washington Iron Works." And this is a big, big place. I mean, by middle of the war, there were 200 employees. It's a big place. And they made steam engines and locomotives and different kinds of boilers and that sort of thing. And there was no way Ramsdell was going to let his daughter be poor, right? So he wanted to make sure Raines was set up so that he could support her. And he really, really fell in love with his son-in-law. It's very important to understand that. And they soon had a daughter. Her name was Fanny, and Fanny was born in 1859. And everything was going swimmingly. We've got the census records. We know that he was worth quite a bit of money. He had two Irish servant girls living in the house. They had a big, beautiful home in Newburgh. And life was really wonderful for George and Frances and Fanny. And then the war came. And when the war came, we don't know exactly what they talked about, but we do know that the older man, Ramsdell, was a staunch Unionist. And so the fact that George would leave when North Carolina seceded, he left and he decided he had to go south. The fact that he would leave his wife and leave his daughter to go south infuriated Homer. And what we do know is that Raines, the best I can tell, he never went back to New York while Homer was still alive. And he only went back once Homer had died after the war, long after the war. So he went down to tender his services to Richmond. And we think he was invited down because they needed somebody to run a big part of their ordnance department, and Raines seemed to be the guy to do that. Raines had a friend, and the friend was Hosea Gorgas, and Hosea Gorgas became the chief Confederate of the Confederate Ordnance Office. Gorgas knew Raines, and their wives knew each other somehow. We're not sure how exactly. And so Raines takes this convoluted, crazy trip. He goes all the way down to Savannah on a ship. In Savannah, they think he's a spy. He logs into a hotel room. They think he's a spy. It's in the newspapers. It's all written up. Then they find out that this guy that is a spy from New York is on his way to Charleston. And of course, all Raines was doing was trying to catch ships to get up to Richmond because he couldn't make a direct connection to Richmond. Well, eventually he gets to Richmond, and I have found some really interesting information. he met in a hotel room which is where President Davis was meeting at that time, did a lot of his meetings in a hotel room. He met with Gorgas and he met with President Davis, and the three of them talked about what was needed the most. And what was needed the most was the fact that the South was entering the war with absolutely no ability to make gunpowder on any significant scale at all. The only thing they had was 4 very small powder mills that were only local mills. In other words, they would make rough powder to blast stumps or to blast tunnels, that sort of thing. But gunpowder for military purposes is completely different. And most people have no idea that there are many, many, many kinds of gunpowder that need to be made in order to function, to have a mid-19th century Army function. For example, there was pistol powder. Pistol powder was different from musket powder, which was different from rifled musket powder, which was different from powder for artillery pieces. Field artillery needed a different kind of powder than the giant Columbiad or Seacoast guns. All of those were different kind of grains. They made the powder slightly differently. And so the South had no way to do that. So where did they get their gunpowder? Well, that's an interesting question, because that question was raised not only in the Southern newspapers, but it was raised in the Northern newspapers before Fort Sumter, during the firing of Fort Sumter, that period, and after Fort Sumter for months and months and months and months. The big question that is debated in the newspapers across the country, all the way to Sacramento, Sacramento Union had an article too, to Minnesota, to Maine, it was everywhere. So everybody understood this. And the big question was, pardon my French, how the hell is the South going to fight a war when all of the powder mills are in the North? How is that possible? You have DuPont in the North, and you have the Hazard Powder Company in the North, and you have several other smaller ones, but there were none of any consequence in the South. And so the Northern newspapers were arguing, well, if all of the powder is in the North, how can the South fight any kind of a protracted war? Which is a very good question. Well, at the beginning of the war, all the powder that the South came into possession of, they came in because they conquered or the North surrendered arsenals and forts to the South. So from Texas all the way across all the states to Fort Sumter to Norfolk, the fall of Norfolk was a big pile. They got tons and tons and tons of gunpowder and ammunition and artillery pieces and fixed ammunition. So the South was well equipped for a very, very, very short time. And by well equipped, I mean they could fight a battle or two if they had everything distributed in the right place at the right time. Well, that's a problem. So Davis, Gorgas, and Raines sat there and talked about what they needed done. And what they needed done was they needed a central government powder plant. And they needed Raines to run it. He needed to build it. He needed to figure out what they needed. He needed to create it. And he needed to figure out where to put it. So Raines got carte blanche to do anything he wanted in that regard. And they say that Davis gave him the carte blanche, and I know Raines pretty darn well after studying him for 30 years. I'm telling you, Raines demanded carte blanche from Davis because he knew bureaucratic baloney. He knew if people were putting the weight of potentially fighting the war on his shoulders, he was going to do it his way. He wasn't going to do it with some bureaucrats telling him how to do it. So the only way he would have accepted it is to say, look, I want carte blanche. I'm going to do it my way. Trust me to do it or find somebody else. I know that's what Raines said because he got the carte blanche. Davis would never have given all of that to somebody and that he didn't know or trust, but he did, and he gave it to Raines, and Raines left. So Raines rode the railroad out to Tennessee, and he's got to Nashville. This is July of 1861, so we're just a couple of months past Fort Sumter. The South is trying to distribute what little gunpowder and ammunition it has to put it in the different seaports, put it in Virginia, got down in New Orleans, down in Mobile, and up in Tennessee around Nashville. And he was going to Nashville first because he wanted to work with the Nashville authorities because they had a good powder mill there, potentially, called the Sycamore Powder Mill, just outside Nashville. So Raines worked up that powder mill. He worked up another one southeast of Nashville. called the Whiteman Mill, and he worked with the governor there to get the whole ordnance industry up and running. While he was doing that, Raines was going around the South looking at different cities, trying to figure out, where do I put the Augusta Powder Works? And that ends up in Augusta. He thought maybe Atlanta was the place. He was disappointed in Atlanta. There were many different requirements that had to have. It couldn't be too far north because it couldn't freeze. They couldn't use a fire to warm the buildings, of course, because it would ignite the powder. It had to have a river. It had to have canal power. It had to be close enough to a city for workers. It had to be on a railroad line. It couldn't be too close to and threatened by invasion. So it couldn't be anywhere in any of the seacoast states close to the Atlantic. So that took out that whole rim. It couldn't be up in Tennessee because of the weather and how close it was to the frontier. So it really narrowed it down. When he got to Augusta, Georgia, he realized there were great railroads. There was a wonderful canal. You've got the Savannah River there. It's deep inside Confederate territory. It had the right soil. It had the right wood available for the charcoal. It had everything Raines thought he needed. And so they ended up buying the land, and they ended up constructing what would become a 2-mile-long complex of buildings. I mean, let that sink in for just a second. A 2-mile-long complex of buildings. And I think I've got, can everybody see the refinery building there?
Yes, we're seeing it.
Yeah, it's weird talking to a screen and not hearing anything. It's strange.
Yeah,
So basically, let me just give you just a little rundown on how he built these and kind of tell you what it was. I had a map and I forgot to put the map in here. What you're seeing here was one end of the building. So Augusta is beyond the picture. Okay, it's about 3/4 of a mile or so beyond what you're seeing. And so train loads of stone and brick and wood and all the materials they would need would come from that direction. And the mill was set up, the powder mill being the entire complex, was set up pretty much, not exactly, but pretty much to where it would mimic the process of producing the powder. For example, the grand refinery building that you see there, the offices were in the corner towers, by the way. The refinery building, they refined saltpeter and charcoal and sulfur, and they did different kinds of ballistic tests inside there for a while. That was all on that end because that's what you'd need to do. You'd need to make the wood for the charcoal there and that sort of thing. And then you would go down to another mill, and then you'd go down to the incorporating mills, and you'd grind up the powder there, and then you'd go farther down and you'd sift it, and then you'd separate it, and you'd go all the way down the line. Some of the buildings were on the other side of the canal. You can see right in the bottom of your screen there. They were on the other side of the canal, and so they'd go back and forth, and they were separated by hundreds of yards because if one building exploded, he didn't want everything to catch fire and explode. So this 2-mile-long complex, of course, what's at the end? The powder magazines, right? And they built a spur railroad line to connect up over to the Georgia Railroad so that they could just put the powder that was finished right there onto the railroad, and off it went to wherever it was needed. And so it's really interesting, and this is just a little side tidbit. The building on the left you see is the laboratory building. And what's interesting is Raines didn't think he needed the laboratory building when they first started laying out the buildings in September of '61. And so they built the refinery building and started building that. And then just to the left of the screen, not too far, is the beginning of the incorporating mills. Well, they couldn't do all the laboratory work they needed in the refinery building. And it was like, God damn it, we need a laboratory building, but there's no place to build it. Because behind all this are all the stables and everything else. And then there's heavy trees and the Savannah River further on the left. So they had to squeeze this laboratory building in, and they built it in such a way that it would withstand a blast from the mills, which are just off to the left. There is very little space between the refinery building and the incorporating mills. And that was pretty dangerous. And luckily they didn't suffer an explosion that damaged the laboratory. But so Raines builds this 2-mile-long complex. And while this complex is being built, it starts being built in September of 61. I want you to think about this. April is Fort Sumter. May, nothing of consequence is happening. So no big battles to speak of. June, same thing, right? There's some fighting out west and some little things here and there, but no big battles. We come into the third week of July and we end up with Bull Run, right? Manassas in Northern Virginia. Then we've got August, September, October, November, December. So all these months are going by and there's not a lot happening. And Raines is saying, thank God. Here's why. When September comes around and Raines is in Augusta working, he's only there part-time. In other words, he might be there for 2 or 3 days. He's got architects there, engineers there. He's got some wonderful high-level staff people that are amazingly qualified. And Raines is riding the rails. He's on the railroad cars constantly. And I've got his whole itinerary down. He put on so many thousands of miles on the railroads. It's crazy. But he would go from Augusta back up to Nashville, down into Alabama, over to Mississippi, back over to Tennessee, up to Richmond for a meeting, down to South Carolina to look at other mills, down into Georgia to Savannah, back up to Augusta, back up to Tennessee, almost nonstop. And everywhere he's going, he's sending telegrams, he's writing letters, he's drawing out drawings for the mills. He's doing all that sort of thing and building that up. But his big concern at the time, and it is an overarching concern, is what's happening in the Western Theater. And this is what I guarantee you none of you have heard before. We've all heard that the South was low on ordnance or ammunition. I mean, we've all heard that they were a little light on that front. You have no idea how light they were on that front. And I'm going to tell you because I've discovered a new memorandum about 30 pages long that Raines wrote before the war ended. And it was all about his thoughts, what he did, where he went from the beginning of the war to the time he stopped writing, which would have been, I believe it was late December of 64, maybe January 65. In September, when Raines is working in Tennessee and Nashville, he's working in Augusta, he's working in Alabama, a man is assigned to command the Western Theater. Anybody know who that man was for the South? No?
Smith?
Albert City Johnston, right? Albert City Johnston, Davis's friend, goes to Richmond, comes from California, goes to Richmond, gets assigned a full general, and goes out to take control of the Western Theater. Well, he's going to command, at that time, troops from Missouri, so west of the Mississippi, across to the edge of Kentucky, and then across the top of Tennessee toward the Appalachian, all the way to the Appalachian Range. Well, one of the generals, Polk, decided to occupy Columbus, Kentucky, which was absolutely idiotic, and it was just insanity, but it's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about tonight. But when he went into Columbus, and Columbus is right there in the junction of where Missouri and Kentucky sort of come together down there, he occupies Columbus, and troops from the north and troops from the south move into Kentucky. What that does is it makes Johnson's front about 300 miles long from the river at Columbus all the way across Kentucky through Bowling Green up to Cumberland Gap. That front is about 300 miles. Now, his left also was supported by 2 forts, Henry and Donelson, which are just below the Tennessee border in northwest Tennessee. Johnson's front is 300 miles long. He's got very few troops, about 35,000 troops, I think, spread out over all of that. And there's pockets of men. They're all green. None of them have any experience. And the one thing that was fascinating to me is Raines talks in his memorandum about the fact that they only had enough gunpowder in the West to fight a skirmish. I want you to think about that for a second. It's September, so the war's been going on for several months. Johnston knows this, and he's mad as hell. I mean, he's trying to get ammunition. He's trying to get a proper gunpowder. He's trying to get the powder he needs for his artillery pieces. And as Raines talks about it, all the powder that they got in Norfolk and the powder for the big arsenals, most of it went to Virginia because they thought that was where the big battles were going to be fought. They didn't think they were going to be fought initially in the West or at all in the West. Well, the North during this whole period has one piece of information after another, after another, after another appearing in all the newspapers. The South has no gunpowder. The South can't fight. Davis knew it. Raines knew it. Johnston knew it. According to Raines, and our best guess is that in September and October, there's no powder coming out of Tennessee, by the way, at this time yet. Not until probably the end of October did the Sycamore Mill make any kind of powder. So there's no powder coming out anywhere from Augusta to anywhere, no powder. And Raines, the best guess I have by looking at all the facts is that they could fight one probably medium-sized battle, probably nothing as big as Bull Run in Tennessee or Kentucky, and then they would not be able to fight a second. Let that sink in for just a minute. Surprisingly, that was true in Virginia too. There's letters from Lee when Lee was head of the state forces there, and they're talking about how there's not even enough gunpowder for the men to have much target practice to fire their weapons. And they had enough for Bull Run, for Manassas. They probably could have fought another one, but they couldn't have fought a third. The point I'm trying to make is that it's October of the war. It's months after Bull Run. If the South had fought, if the North had moved down Buell or Halleck, those are the two guys who were dividing up Kentucky for the Union. They both had small armies. If they had just moved ahead to Bowling Green, for example, if Buell had moved to Bowling Green, he had more troops, better armed, and a little better trained than Hardee had in Bowling Green. If he had moved down there and fought and lost, I'm talking about Buell, and then retreated, reorganized, and attacked again, just marched down and fought again, that would have been it. There would have been no more powder left on an entire 300-mile front, all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. Think about that. The Sycamore Mill starts making good powder in about November. And according to Raines, the powder that was made in Nashville went to Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island Number 10. Some of it went up to Columbus. Well, then something happened in February of 1862. Augusta's still not making gunpowder. Augusta doesn't make gunpowder until April 10th of 1862. Well, in February of 1862, Grant is moving along the rivers, and he's going to launch the Henry and Donelson campaign. I didn't realize it until not too long ago, and I never put two and two together, that Raines witnessed the bombardment of Fort Donelson by the Union gunboats. And it's not too far from Nashville. He somehow he made it up there, and he wanted to be there, and he did. And he witnessed it, he wrote about it, and he was close enough to the Union gunboats to describe them to Robert E. Lee, who commanded the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and East Florida. And he wrote about it and told them, this is what the gunboats are looking like. This is how thick their armor is. This is what kind of artillery would destroy these gunboats. And we're in trouble because these gunboats are pounding the hell out of these forts. And Raines, when Fort Donelson fell, went back to Nashville because he realized that whole line now is gone. We're going to lose Nashville. Losing Nashville meant they lose the only gunpowder mills that functioned, the only ones. There were a couple small ones in South Carolina. They were worthless. There was a Navy mill in Petersburg, but it was just beginning to operate. Didn't operate very long, but that was only for the Navy. That's it. There was no powder mill in Virginia or Richmond, even though some sources say there wasn't. There was no other one in Georgia, no other one in Florida, no other one in Alabama, no other one in Mississippi. There were two, potentially three, although one of them exploded quickly, in New Orleans. But they needed all that powder in New Orleans, and they were sending a lot of that into the Trans-Mississippi Theater. So that whole middle section, the heartland of the South, there were no other powder mills. And Nashville fell just a short time after Donelson. Raines raced back at all the equipment, all the workers, everything he possibly could. He He got railroad cars. He put everything on these cars he could, and he sent them down to Georgia. But he went ahead of schedule. He did all that in about a day and a half, left his officers to finish it. He raced back to Augusta. He wrote the letter to Lee. He drew the Union gunboat in the letter. Why was this important? Because he suddenly realized, and he used to make fun of it, the people who were worried about Savannah falling. And he suddenly realized, my God, if they can take Donelson this easily, and our rifled artillery, the Union rifle artillery, our rifle artillery beat the heck out of Sumter in a day at Masonry Fort, how long is Pulaski going to last in Savannah? And the Savannah River goes right up to Augusta. And he was suddenly very, very worried about what would happen. And so Rains wrote this letter to Lee, and Lee had no men to spare, and Rains was the one who was left to obstruct the river. In addition to building everything else, he had to obstruct the river, and he had to find guns to obstruct it. He had to raise local troops to man it. The man was doing everything you can possibly imagine, in between taking trains up to Richmond to meet with Davis and Gorgas every couple months. The man was everywhere. He also was given command of the arsenals in the South, one at a time. He would be sent to Mississippi. He had to go to Holly Springs, Mississippi, and look at the arsenal there and order certain parts. He had to go into Alabama to do that. He went back into Georgia, went to Rome and different places to see that the guns were being cast correctly. Rains was doing yeoman's work. It was really incredible. Well, when April came around, the powder mill started producing gunpowder. And once April came and the powder mill starts producing thousands of pounds of gunpowder a day, the powder shortage eased. So once it eased, Rains can breathe a sigh of relief in that sense. However, what else is happening at the same time? All the spring battles of 1862 are starting. Now the war is really starting in earnest. And of course, once it starts, it goes on all the way to Appomattox. And the amount of powder that was demanded of him was incredible. And they would make 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 pounds of powder a day out of that 2-mile complex. And it was shipped everywhere. So think about this now. We have one primary powder mill in Augusta producing all of the gunpowder, about 98% of the gunpowder that was used west of the Mississippi River. It was all in one location, and it went to supply all the armies in the field, all of the seacoast guns, everything, except for naval powder. And that came out of Petersburg, and then it came out of a North Carolina mill where they moved it a little bit later. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. So let me see here. All right. Any questions so far? I'd love to just take a few questions if you don't mind.
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody in there. You feel free to be able to ask your questions. You can also put a message into the chat window if you have a question and you're not able to use the audio. You may need to be able to unmute yourself locally to be able to ask questions in here as well.
The question I have is, what was the basic formulation that was common to all the various types of gunpowder that had to be made? Besides the saltpeter, what else was there that he had to have, and where did it all come from?
Sure. Yeah, and the interesting thing is this is such a complex topic. I'm writing a book on it now, and I'm about 80% done. It's going to be a big book.
Wow.
Mark Newell. Where's Mark Newell? Is Mark still on? Mark's helping me read it and critique it. I'm really happy about that.
Yeah.
Who asked the question? Who asked the question?
Roy Atherton.
All right, Roy. Yeah, whoever asked the question, do me a favor and tell me what your first name is.
Okay, it's Roy, and I'm the RA
Right,
up
Roy.
in the corner.
All right, so gunpowder came from saltpeter or niter, charcoal, and sulfur. The South had a lot of sulfur because they used sulfur in the sugarcane production. So they had a lot of sulfur. They imported some. Saltpeter or niter from abroad, but most of the niter came from caves. They would scrape out of the soil in caves. And Rains also oversaw that over a multi-state area The problem with that was all that niter had to be refined and purified, and it was a big chemical process. And he set all that up and helped oversee that as well. And then you had to make the charcoal, and you mix all those ingredients together. The difference in the different kinds of powder was it was the same ingredients mixed the same way, but it was the grains of powder, the size of the grains of powder. The grains of powder for, if you guys have had a shotgun or something, you know how small the powder grains are. The grains of powder that fired those big Columbiad Seacoast guns were the size of hen's eggs. That's how big those grains were. And so it was a big process to get the right powder built, made the right way, and shipped to the right location where it was needed. Janet, you had a question about where was Francis. What we know is that Francis did not come south for about at least a year, and she ended up eventually coming through the blockade. We have no letters between Francis and George, none of them have survived. I think I know where some of them are. I haven't been able to get my hands on them yet. Been looking for 30 years, but I think I found some, but I haven't read them yet. We only know this because George would tell his friends this. Mansfield Lovell, who ran New Orleans, who got a really unfair rap for losing the city, was one of Raines's best friends, and their wives were very close. And Raines would say, you're lucky your wife is here. My dear Frances hasn't been able to come through the blockade, and they won't give her a pass to come through the lines. And so eventually she comes through with her daughter, Fanny, and they ended up staying in Augusta. And this is a little side note, and it's very sad. Nobody knew what happened to Fanny after the war, other than the fact she died young. It was his only child. And there was literally no information anywhere. We finally found, not too long ago, that she died in a hotel room in Boston at the age of 24 after laying there and suffering for 22 days. And she had some sort of sepsis in her intestines, and she died at 23 years old in Boston. And that's all we know. Now, George was down teaching in the medical college, so he didn't go back. And his father-in-law was still alive. And so there's no evidence that he went back, but we know that the father-in-law was very mad at him still for leaving his family. And so, but he didn't go back for her funeral, as far as I understand.
Also, but it wasn't, he was from the South. Oh God, we've lost it. That's my.
So we are hearing some other audio here. If you do have a question for Ted, please go ahead and unmute. But if you are just listening, you can leave your microphone muted. You'll still be able to hear, but it would allow Ted to be able to speak. So I'm going to leave it so that people can unmute. But if we do start to hear some audio feedback, I will mute those individuals just for the sake of our presenter here.
Yeah.
Ted,
Okay,
this hello to
Yeah.
Nina. I was
Yep.
one. I know you did this on purpose just so I could mention it, but you left out the October 1861 Battle of Ball's Bluff, which of course is another major battle that happened in that time period. And the question I have for you though is, listening to you talk about what Raines did relative to gunpowder in the South, am I wrong in thinking that without Raines, the South had no chance of fighting the war?
Well, I suppose they would have put somebody else in charge. It's hard for me to figure out who else there was, because the other person that they wanted, Mordecai, he refused to leave the Union Army, and he resigned his commission, but he didn't come south. There was nobody else that they thought was capable. Gorgas, who ran the Ordnance Department, who was very capable, he didn't have the right temperament to do what Raines did. So I don't know who else would have done it or could have done it at that scale. What's important to realize, we all study battles and tactics and all this kind of stuff. And, we like studying Stonewall Jackson or Sherman or whomever. But here's what we forget. You have to back all of this up to realize that if he had been unsuccessful in building Augusta, there would have been no Civil War. Grant would never be president. You would barely have heard of Robert E. Lee. There would be no Stonewall Jackson. None of that. Because the South could not fight the war. When I tell people this, sometimes they scratch their heads and they think, well, it couldn't be that simple. Oh, it's that simple. And I've got scores of newspaper articles, north to south, and they're all talking about the same thing. There's no powder in the South. Why aren't we attacking? Why are we standing still? And so I have this little teaser. What did the Lincoln administration know, and when did they know it? They had to have known exactly what the South had, and I'll tell you why I know this. At the beginning of the war, the Southern politicians got the South into this big war, and they didn't know what the hell they were doing or what they were getting into. And you can read their correspondence, and once they're at war now, and they're firing on Fort Sumter, they're asking Gorgas and Raines, okay, how do we fight this now? Do we have enough powder? Where are our powder mills? Do we have powder mills? Literally, this is in their literature. This is in their letters. We hear there's a powder mill in North Carolina, maybe. We hear there might be a powder mill in Southeast Georgia. They don't even know. And so when they're asked to do an inventory, and Gorgas goes in front of Congress with interrogatories, and he answers all these questions, he gives them an absolutely precise to the pound inventory of what the South has. Now, where did the South get all that? They got it from Northern installations. Who else had all that information? The Northern Quartermaster Department. So the Stanton War Department had the same information from the quarterly reports and monthly reports filed by all these arsenal people. So they knew what the South captured. They also knew the South had no powder mills. They were all in the North. So if you take a pencil and you take a piece of paper and you sit your butt down and you do a little simple 6th grade math, you can figure out it takes this much powder for this many men to have this many cartridges to fire this long. And you can figure out how long the South can fight.
Ted, would Lincoln's frustration with McClellan be tied to the fact that Lincoln understood the deficiencies of Southern gunpowder, and he was even more frustrated, therefore, by virtue of the fact that McClellan seemed content to sit and do nothing?
Well, this is an interesting question, and it's one I've asked myself. It might have something to do with it. What's very strange is you can go in Stanton's papers, there's almost nothing mentioned about gunpowder. Lincoln, I can't find anything about it. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't talk about it, because of course they talked about it. You can't fire a weapon without ordnance supplies. So they talked about it, but why didn't they act? It's in every newspaper, so of course everybody's reading it, and they're all reading the same thing. When an Augusta newspaper publishes an article that says, oh, we're finally getting a powder mill in Augusta to make all the powder for the South, guess where that newspaper article ends up a week later? In the Washington newspaper, and in an Ohio newspaper, right? And in a Pennsylvania newspaper. So they're all trading articles, and they all have spies, and they all have reporters all over the country. So they all knew this. So Michael, to answer your question, I don't know. It might be part of it because he wanted them to push hard. But I want to leave you with that and go real quickly, because I know about 10 minutes I want to talk to you about the rest of the war. But I want you to consider the fact that everybody knew there was no powder. Everybody knew there was very little to be had. But just because you had the gunpowder, you also had to distribute it to where it was needed. So where do you send the fixed artillery ammunition? Where do you send the small arms cartridges? Where do you send the pistol powder? You have to not only, just because you have it doesn't mean you're going to have it where you need it. So they had to distribute it where they thought they needed it, and they didn't put almost anything in the West. So Johnston spent months knowing he could not fight a battle. It's incredible to think about that. And it's true. And that's really, to me, it changes the way you look at the way the Union prosecuted the war. And I think it needs a lot of information, a lot of investigation on that front, because let me get one more thing. I've opened up every major history of the war, right? From whether it's Jack Davis's or Hathaway's or Stoker's or whomever, it doesn't matter who. Everybody who writes a big history of the Civil War, look inside those books. In almost none of them will you find the name George Raines. In almost none of them will you find the fact that, in none of them you'll find that Johnson couldn't fight a full battle. None of them say that. Thus, they say, well, Johnson was complaining because he didn't have enough gunpowder. One of them took Johnson's son to task and called him hysterical after the war because he was saying that his father didn't have enough ordnance supplies to fight a battle. And they called the son for saying that in like the Battles and Leaders or some article, the hysterical rantings of his son. Really? His son knew. His son was right. My point is that the historians who were writing about all this are only walking in ankle deep, and they're not asking the fundamental question. Well, if they don't have a lot of ordnance supplies, what does that mean exactly? How much did they have? Did the North know? Well, these are the questions that I'm endeavoring to answer, and I'm positing them to you because I want you to think about that a little bit because it's very important. Let's go on really quickly to the second part of the war. Every time there's a major battle, Rains follows it very closely. Why? Because he has to know where to ship the powder. He has to know how much to make. He has to know where it needs to go. And so as he's doing that, what's happening to the South? It's shrinking. South Carolina, Augusta was within range of a cavalry strike from the coast for about 2.5 years. It never came. He was worried about it. He talked about it all the time. He wrote letters to the War Department, and he wrote letters to Gorgas, his friend, which were pretty short sometimes. And it was like, and I'm not kidding, do you people understand this is the backbone of the Confederacy? The rail lines from Augusta to Atlanta to Chattanooga, this is the spine. And if Augusta falls, well, you can kiss it all goodbye because we all know the importance of what's going on here. So why am I not getting support? There's not even a man stationed in Augusta. Why? I need troops here. Put a brigade here. Put a regiment here. And they didn't. And it's wild. It's crazy, but they didn't. So as the war is going on and the area is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, you got Sherman. And I'm not going to give him all the due that this conversation deserves, but I want to just share it with you so you can ask some questions if you have them. When Sherman comes into Georgia, it's May of 1864, and he's driving down against an army under Joe Johnston that ends up, once it gets Polk's troops, has probably something close to like 75,000 men. It's a big Confederate army. He drives all the way to the gates of Atlanta in July, mid-July 1864. Now, once he gets down there, he has ready access to the Georgia Railroad all the way to Augusta. Sherman does. He fights all the way around Augusta, around Atlanta, until early September when Atlanta falls. So he spends, July, August, and a day or two in September fighting there. During that whole period, Rains is sure they're coming. Why aren't they sending cavalry to destroy what we have here? We barely have entrenchments. They built light earthworks around Augusta, but I've got the map. You can't put a 2-mile-long complex inside fortifications. And so half of it is outside the fortifications. Think about that. You couldn't have protected the Augusta Powder Works at all. So Sherman goes down, Atlanta falls, Hood's army goes north, Sherman's there, he decides I'm going to the sea, right? And of course, what are they going to do? So Rains, when they start marching inland, they're sure they're going to Augusta. Why wouldn't they go to Augusta? I mean, that would end the war. But they don't go to Augusta. Sherman feints Augusta, he feints at Macon, and he skedaddles to Savannah. Gets to Savannah, takes it. In the meantime, Rains had to make a decision, and the decision was, what do I do with the equipment here? He took the most valuable equipment, put it on rail cars, a big, long train, put it over the river and put it into South Carolina to protect it. When Sherman passed and went to Savannah, Rains was shocked. Oh my God, how could that be? How could he bypass Augusta? He goes back, he recreates the powder works. They were down for about 30 days, and it really cost them a lot of powder. But they started making powder again, started shipping powder again. And what happened, a month and a half later, Sherman moves north into the Carolinas. Well, he does the same thing. He plays Augusta off against Charleston, just like he played Macon off against Augusta. He splits whatever Confederate forces are there, which is almost nobody, and he drives north into the Carolinas. He doesn't go after Augusta again, even though it was within striking distance for months, about 8 months. It was easily within striking distance. He never even made an attempt. So I would argue this. There's a lot of things we can talk about here, but I'm going to tell you this. And I'm a fan of Sherman. I mean, I think Sherman, is a good general. When I read all this, the reason my whole view of all of this changed was because I was the first one to find and use the day-to-day operational records of the Powder Works. Nobody else, no other historian had ever used them. I don't think anybody had ever even seen them. It's crazy, but they were just sitting there in the National Archives. I made copies of them, went through them. They're day-to-day operational records of everything you can imagine, where the powder went, what they made, how many people were working, how many slaves, how many free, who was skilled, everything. And I started looking through that, and it all of a sudden I leaned back and I realized, wait a minute, now I understand the true importance of Augusta. It was known everywhere. And if Augusta had fallen, the South only had enough powder for about 6 to 8 weeks of fighting. And there was nowhere to replace it. Couldn't be replaced. So Sherman was asked afterward, why didn't you take Augusta? And Sherman says, well, I didn't need to take Augusta. This is post-war. I don't need to take Augusta. I didn't need to take it because I cut all the railroads all the way around Augusta so they could choke on their powder. They couldn't ship it. So why did I have to go to Augusta? That's a lie. It's a bald-faced lie. And I'll tell you why it's a lie. When Sherman was in Atlanta and he was heading for Savannah, he didn't know he was going to end up in the Carolinas cutting more railroads all the way around Augusta because the plan was to get on ships and sail to Grant. So when he bypassed Augusta, he didn't know he was going to bypass it because he was going to be in the Carolinas and cut all the railroads, because that wasn't the plan. The plan was to go on ships and join Grant in Virginia. But then when he went again north, he figured, well, that's my alibi, right? I can just, maybe I made a mistake in not taking Augusta, but I can say I cut all the railroads. Well, I looked at the day-to-day operational records. Guess what? Raines had crews out repairing railroads. Where they couldn't repair railroads, they had wagon trains for the powder. And Raines shipped tons and tons and tons and tons of powder from the time Sherman could have taken Augusta all the way through to the end of the war. He shipped it to Lee, to Richmond. He shipped it to Joe Johnson. The powder Joe Johnson fought the North Carolina campaign with was the powder that would have been stopped if Sherman had taken Augusta. Wouldn't have been there. The powder that was fought for some of the Western battles, same kind of thing. The Franklin and Nashville could never have been fought without that powder. All of that powder would not have been available if Sherman had destroyed Augusta, which had, at the beginning of the March to the Sea, had 4,000 troops defending it by that time, mostly old men and young boys. And we've got their telegrams and letters talking about it. So I'll leave you with this. If Sherman was willing to drive south against Atlanta and take a city that did not end the war, because Atlanta fell, the war did not end. If he was willing to do that against an army of 75,000 men and fight against a city that was heavily fortified, against absolute veteran troops, and bring about that kind of bloodshed, and he was willing to send Stoneman on a raid 100 miles south of Atlanta. And he was willing, and there were cavalry raids all over the place. I mean, look at Price's raid in Missouri, covered, 1,000 miles? You mean to tell me he couldn't have sent a division of cavalry up when he had Hood's army pressed against Atlanta? What were the Confederates going to do? He couldn't send a division and a battalion of guns and an infantry brigade? He had a railroad now. He could go right up the railroad to Augusta, 130 miles. He never even tried. And so I would argue that when you think about the importance of Augusta, now that you know it, very few people know it, when you think about that, when you think about how Sherman is praised constantly about the brilliant campaign when he marched to the sea and the brilliant campaign going into the Carolinas, I would leave you with this. Open up every book that's ever been written on the march to the sea, the Georgia campaigns and the Carolina campaigns, marching to the Carolinas. Open every 9 out of 10 don't even mention Raines. 9 out of 10 don't even mention the Augusta Powder Works. And do you want to know why? Because all these people writing on the war, They don't know. They had no idea. And mostly, not all of them, and a lot of these people are my friends, they're not conducting their own original research. They're taking what one or two people have written and they write it again and they rewrite it again and they rewrite it again and they rely on those sources, and they're not conducting primary research in the specific important areas where they should have been. Because the questions you have to ask is, why was Augusta, there's a powder mill in Augusta, how was it? Nobody asked these questions. Where are the records? Nobody asked, nobody cared. Now that you have both sides of that story, you can see both sides of that fence, you have to evaluate this differently. You have to ask different questions. So
Ted?
let me leave you with that.
Ted, Michael,
And let me take any questions you've got. I'd love to answer them for you.
Ted, you have several questions in the chat window that have been there
Sure.
for a while. So I don't know if you want me to read those or if you want to respond to those. There's a couple that are for you as well.
Ted, can I buy you a bottle of gin? What's your favorite? Yes, you can. No. Okay, so Raines knew Jefferson Davis because Jefferson Davis was Secretary of War.
Could you read the question for everybody as well?
Yeah, how did Raines know Jefferson Davis? Jefferson Davis was Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, so he knew all the old Army officers. That was a small club. It was a very small Army. And so he knew who Raines was, he knew his background, and he knew people who knew who Raines was. So by the time Raines went to Richmond, he would not have just shown up in Richmond and said, hey, I'm here, you know, what can I get commissioned? He went there for a purpose, and the purpose was already set up, probably with telegrams with Gorgas or Davis. We just haven't found those yet. And Davis trusted him because the people that knew Raines and Raines's background trusted him. And so you've got this long personal conversation with Davis, and that was when Davis said, yeah, okay, you're the guy, and you can do this. And that's how that came about. If we visit Augusta today, is there anything left in terms of ruins of the museum? Yeah, the only thing that's left, did I put that in there, the obelisk? No, I didn't. If you go on to Google or one of the search engines and type in Augusta Powder Works, you'll see today the only thing that's left is that big chimney in the middle of the refinery building. There it is. The building back here was the Sibley Cotton Mill. They knocked everything down about 10 years later. The North did. And the excuse they used was the buildings were all falling apart. I don't believe that. I honest to God, I don't believe it. Because the buildings were mostly brick and stone. They were built to high levels of quality. You're telling me those were all falling apart in 10 years? No, no way. They didn't want a monument to the south. They tore it all down, but they left the obelisk. And so what you see, that obelisk there is still there. You can go up right to it, and it's beautiful. The canal's there, but there's nothing else there. All those buildings, the whole 2 mile complex, it's all gone. Nothing else is there.
I also noticed something you may be of interest here, Ted.
Yeah, I started out writing that book, right? Let me back up really quick, and I promise I'll make this fast. I started researching this 30 years ago, and I collected a lot of information. I wrote a couple of magazine articles, and then I had kids, and I'm practicing law, and then I just got sidetracked, and I didn't finish it. And then with a bunch of friends down in Augusta and elsewhere, we put together a book called Never for Want of Powder. The big colorful drawings, all the blueprints of the plant. I think I was with Mark Newell when we found those, but we were in a small museum in Georgia, and they didn't even know they had them. And they were buried in these drawers and stuffed here and there. And I explained to them, these big blueprints are all the handmade blueprints to all these buildings. And so then they promptly locked them away in a vault and wouldn't let me use them for research because I was from California. No Yankee was going to write Georgia history. That's true, actually. I made good friends there, and they opened them up to me, and they let us use them. And we put them in that book in 2007, published by the University of South Carolina Press. And it covers all the sort of gunpowder stuff and the making and the science of it and all that. I thought I was done with Raines. And then I decided I was going to do something on this, and that would be Sherman and the Georgia campaign. And as I started gathering all my material together, I realized I had 3 times the material I thought I had. I didn't know I had collected so much over the years. And I started sifting through it, and I thought, you know, Raines deserves an absolute full biography because he was an important guy, and nobody's going to write it if I don't do this. And so I've been spending the last year 2 or 3 hours a day writing, finishing up my research and writing, and I'm about 80% done now with writing. And that'll be a completely different book. And when I'm done with that, I'll take some of it out and put it in this and get this done.
Michael O'Neill here. I have a question for you. You've persuaded me that Sherman made a mistake in not going and taking out the powder works at Augusta. And obviously he knew it was a mistake because he tried to justify it by suggesting that he had cut off the powder, even though he hadn't really, by allegedly destroying all the railroads. My question, though, is, although we can fault Sherman for that, where is the Union command? I mean, somebody in the North, as you said, it was in all the newspapers. They knew about the Augusta Powder Works. They knew it was the key gunpowder supply for the South. How is it that there was this failure across the board in the Union command to not target Augusta and the powder works there? It just blows my mind.
It's baffling.
You made a very persuasive case, but I'm saying, how is it that the Northern leadership has never been indicted for that utter failure?
It's crazy. There are orders from Grant to Sherman when Sherman's getting ready to start the Georgia campaign. And you always see the first part of the order in every book you've ever read. And the first part of the order basically is, you know, go after Joe Johnson and sink your teeth into him and drive him back and get Atlanta, right? That's the first part. There's another sentence or two after that that says, you have the discretion to do all the damage you want to the Southern war industry. Now, Michael, you're a lawyer. And I'm sorry to say, so am I. Notice you're the only one who laughed because everybody else knows that, you know, lawyers, man. You know. If you have the discretion to go into Georgia and create all the damage you can, would that not give him the chance to go to Macon and take their laboratory in Macon and Central Arsenal there and go to Augusta and take the only powder works in the entire South? Of course it does. So, in other words, it was in his orders. It was part of his orders. He could do that. In May, he could have done it. In June, he could have done it.
Did it actually mention, or did it just say?
No, it said war. I don't remember the exact wording, but it said war industries or ability to make war or ability to continue, go against their industry, that sort of thing.
To me, that does not absolve the leadership of the North, because that should have been a specific target, not a general, go
absolutely.
ahead.
Absolutely.
I'm just amazed that no one in the North has ever been held accountable for the utter failure of knocking out what would have essentially ended the war for all practical purposes.
And not even for all practical purposes. It would have ended the war. Here's how we know. The South could only make a certain amount of powder at a time and ship it. And remember, he's supplying all the powder. I mean, everywhere. And when you look at how much powder is burned off in a Chancellorsville or a Shiloh or a Gettysburg or whatever, as soon as they have a big battle or a big campaign underway, you see the powder works gearing up, and you see them shipping large quantities up to the Richmond Arsenal to put into cartridges and that sort of thing. And so Raines is trying to keep up with all this, but there's only a certain amount in reserve. So if you look at that last half of the siege of Petersburg, none of that would have been possible if the powder works had been destroyed in June or July or August or September or October. Wouldn't have been possible. If they shipped all the powder he made up to Virginia, then the Western Army would have had nothing. Charleston would have had nothing. Savannah would have had nothing. So Mobile would have had nothing. It all came from Augusta. And so Sherman had like 8 months. He could have destroyed that thing anytime he wanted. And there are people who say, well, you know, it's 130 miles away and blah, blah. Well, so, I mean, look at all the cavalry raids that were launched that went 100 miles.
You
There are a
know,
lot of them.
Hey, Ted.
So let me go on and just say, was there a transport system between the buildings? Yes, there was. Partly. They used the canal as a transport. So they would put some of the gunpowder on the canal boats, and they had a mule path, and they'd pull it up to one of the buildings. In between some of the mills, they also had an oak railroad that Raines developed, and it was oak covered with gutta percha rails, and they put that on the oak wheels so it couldn't spark. And they would run it up to the mills. Let me tell you this real quick, because I skipped past this part. There were 12 separate mills that were in one building, and they were faced in opposite directions. And every other side of the building was open with light glass and wood, but in the middle and all the beams supporting all the supporting walls were 3-foot thick stone walls. And the idea was there was a big mill grinding the powder in each of those mills. There were 12 of them, a big rotating cylinder. One of those mills explodes. The idea is it goes out through the light wooden glass and it doesn't spread to all the other mills. And in fact, they had a massive explosion in one of the mills and nothing happened. No real, killed a few people, but it didn't spread and destroy everything, which is pretty amazing. They even had a water sprinkler system that would go over all the mills at the same time if there was a problem. He had all kinds of safety features in place. It was pretty amazing. What kind of, well, that was the safety system right there. Did Confederates make their own musket balls, or was there a plant for the balls? A lot of them made their own balls. Some of the plants made them also and supplied the lead into the armies into the field. And my understanding is they mostly made them close to where the army was. However, the arsenals would take the gunpowder and make the cartridges with the mini balls and ship those cartridges out to the armies also. So most of them came from there, but they also made some in the field. I think for the most part, they're just a level of poor and inconsistent flow of communications.
you know, that was me that had
Yeah.
written that, Roy.
Yeah.
When you think about the long period of time that it took Lincoln to finally replace McCulloch, and the back and forth arguments that went on, it seemed to me that aside from that entire drama, everything else around them wasn't really well communicated to the Western Theater or anywhere else. And the worst part about it is their intelligence, from the North at least, the intelligence gathering was not all that great. And then the South, it was even worse. I can remember how Forrest had, Robert E. Lee had no idea where Forrest went for a period of time. I think it was Forrest. But it seems to me that the war was a perfect demonstration of poor communications and intelligence gathering. And it's something that probably would have failed on its own, no matter how you look at it. The fact that they didn't have gunpowder in the South begs the question, how did they ever get involved in this in the first place, other than the fact that it was really started by a collection of Southern politicians.
Yeah, like all wars, right? They're all created by Southern politicians. They're all created by politicians.
Yeah.
I'm gonna disagree with you though, respectfully and gently.
That's all right.
That the intelligence gathering on certain things was terrible. I agree with you, but on certain other macro issues, the intelligence gathering was outstanding. There are many newspaper articles where they'll say, our spy in Augusta told us this, and it's in a northern newspaper, and he tells them exactly what's going on, and it's only 2 weeks after he was there, and it's in the newspaper. You've got people from London coming and sat down with Raines, and there's like a 3-column, gigantic, beautiful article that he talks to Raines about everything you can imagine, how much powder they're making, where they're sending it, how he did it. it's a London correspondent, and that article ends up in the London Times, and it ends up in a Washington newspaper, and in a Charleston newspaper, and in a Richmond newspaper a month later. So on all these macro issues, they understood completely well that there was no powder in the South, and they didn't have a way to produce it except in Augusta. They knew that, and they knew that immediately, because remember this, it's not like Germany fighting the interior of Russia and not knowing what the hell is there. This was one country before it separated. And one country was won by one army, the United States Army. And the United States Army had all the records of all the arsenals that fell and what was in the arsenals when they fell. So they had all the information. They just didn't act on it. I've talked to some Grant scholars who have come around to my point of view on this, and they're a little shocked and I think embarrassed. And I've asked them, you know the Grant papers better than me, and they've gone through them, and there's virtually nothing about the Augusta Powder Works in any of Grant's papers. Just real general, war industry stuff, gunpowder stuff. But why isn't Augusta a target? Augusta should have been a target. You've got Charleston up there in Savannah. You can see how close it is. Raines always was worried about a raid from Pocatoglio, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Pocatoglio, South Carolina. And there actually was a Union raid contemplated from there once, but it never materialized. And Raines was explaining they could ride here with 2,000 men and burn the powder works. There's nobody here to protect it. But the raid never came. Very lucky. Why were the Richmond Iron Works not similarly destroyed? Well, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond were destroyed. They were burned, and a lot of it was seized. And those were rebuilt after the war. That's my understanding.
Ted, I have a question.
What was that?
Ted, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Clark. The Schofield Union General after the war thought that Sherman's march to the sea and through the Carolinas was more of a giant raid than anything else. And I agree with your assessment that going after the Confederate infrastructure would have been a better move for Sherman. I think you appreciate his talents a little bit more than me. I think he could have ended the war earlier than he did, especially around the battles of Atlanta and Jonesboro later on. But how much sooner do you think he might have been able to shorten the war if he'd have gone straight for Augusta, then Columbus, Fayetteville, and then Petersburg?
The war would have been over in the summer, late summer, '64, because the South couldn't have continued fighting. There's an interesting thing about Sherman, and I like Sherman because he's a little quirky and a little crazy, and I like quirky, crazy people. He did not have a killer instinct. And people say, well, that's crazy. That's just Sherman. No, he let enemy armies escape several times, including around Atlanta, including around Savannah. I think this is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the killer instinct, I mean, the real killer instinct would have been to go after the infrastructure, especially when it's 98% of it is located in one mostly undefended city. My wife had a real curious observation about this. I was chatting with her about this one day, and she says, well, he's supposed to go through Georgia and make Georgia howl, right? Yeah. And he was going to bring that war to a close and punish the Southern people, right? Yeah. Well, did he want the war to end quickly? And I like looking at things differently, right? Whether it's right or wrong. I mean, to me, that's always irrelevant. The question is, think differently, right? So I flipped that cube up on my shoulder and I turned it around and I looked at another facet of it and I thought, okay, now, did he want the war to end? And I said, tell me more about that. Now, she has no military interest, she has, none of that, but she's good with people. And she said, well, he's a general, he's successful, they're going to win, right? There's really no doubt they're going to win. I said, yeah, there's no doubt the North's going to win. She said, well, if he'd taken Augusta and ended the war quickly, and he's a military guy, is he ever going to be able to fight in a war like this again? No. So why take Augusta? if you know you're going to win the war, why not just keep going? Let your men march up. Let your men punish the South. Why stop? Why take Augusta? And I thought, well, that's curious, because I'd never thought about it that way. Maybe it wasn't intentionally not taken. I don't know, right? We'll never know. But I thought that was an odd way of looking at it, and a clever way to come at something from a different perspective, because it makes you think differently.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Tim in Highland Park, California. There was a
Yes,
show
sir.
on 60 Minutes. Yeah, Tim, Highland Park, California. There was a show on 60 Minutes about a month ago about the big Iranian air attack on U.S. air base about 100 miles from Iran. And they're going through this like this is what happened. They found out about it in the afternoon, and they evacuated all the planes and everything out into the desert. So, but they left just a small amount of people watching it there, and everybody knew that everybody who stayed there was going to get punked. You know, that was it. And they said, well, they had to keep them there because they had to have some small force to guard the place if it was invaded by Iran. And I'm asking all kinds of questions like your husband does, or excuse me, like your wife did. It's like, why are you having an American air base in the middle of Iraq, 100 miles from Iran? And they actually said in the story there was no defense of the place. That's why they had to evacuate everything, because they knew the missiles were coming. And there's no defense of the place. And so they moved everything out into the desert with the exception of that small group of people who were supposedly supposed to defend it if something happened. Well, if they were worried about defending it when something happened, why didn't they have a huge amount of defense around a major air base within 100 miles of Iran?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, and I'm listening to what you were saying about this, and then I think, boy, military stupidity goes back hundreds of years. Is what it seems
Well,
like to me.
it goes back to the beginning of time. There are a lot of Rain's telegrams and letters, and he spends a lot of time. He has to raise militia himself, clerks. He combs hospitals for people who are wounded who could maybe come in and make powder. And he's constantly telling Richmond, look, just give me a brigade, give me a regiment, give me something. There's got to be something here, because it's the most important city in the South, and nobody's guarding it. And nobody did until, basically October or so of '64. There was really nobody there. And what's interesting about that is that no matter what he said, no matter how important it was, they didn't send anybody to him. And it's
there a chance, Ted, that Michael Odonino here, that you would agree then that it was a total failure of the Confederate leadership in the fact that they neglected to properly have defenses for Augusta. Would you agree with that?
Well, this is an interesting thing. Yes, I would agree with it, because they didn't have a crystal ball. Augusta was the only major city in the South that never fell.
But my
It was never
question
captured.
is, if you would agree that it was a failure of the Southern leadership not to properly defend a critical infrastructure component such as the powder works at Augusta, could we say that the failure of the Confederate leadership to properly defend it kind of misled the North about maybe it's not that important if the South isn't even trying to defend it?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that, no, because the North knew it was the only place that they produced powder on
Then
scale.
that's a more damning indictment of the entire Northern leadership, not just Sherman, but
Oh, the
everyone
entire War Department, yeah, all of them.
for not targeting Augusta. I still am amazed that the entire Northern leadership, not one single individual, has acquitted themselves well with regard to such a critical component of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is, and I'll get to that question about what happened to Rains after the war in just a second. If you look at the cities in the Confederacy, Augusta was, I am convinced, and I wasn't until I did the research, I'm convinced Augusta was the most important city in the South. And the reason I can say that is because if Augusta was gone, the South couldn't fight for about another 6 or 8 weeks. That's it. It was done. And so if you reverse engineer that to the very early part of the war, we were talking about McClellan earlier and Halleck and all those guys. If you take Irwin McDowell and he fights and bungles his way through at Bull Run and he gets his gets his butt kicked and he goes back to Washington, if they had let those soldiers rest for a week and sent them back out again and they lost again, the war's over in the East. Now, if I told you that, you'd go, no way. Oh, yeah. 2 big battles, and that's it. That's how little they had. Now, you ask yourself, well, why was the South fighting any battles at all? The reason is because they didn't think it was going to be a long war. Most of them still didn't quite believe it. Davis thought it would be, and he was planning for it. Lincoln probably thought it would be a long war, but a lot of people just didn't really think it would be. Maybe 1 battle, maybe 2. Oh no, they were wrong.
Will
And if Davis hadn't planned in advance, the South would have been in real trouble.
Will your book, Ted, be clear in indicting the entire Northern leadership?
Well, I'm gonna put all the facts out there, and I'm gonna let people reach their own conclusions.
You found a publisher?
You know,
I think
actually, I've been offered it by a couple presses, but no, I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to publish it myself because
When do you expect it to be out? I'm excited. I can't wait to read
about
it.
a year, probably about a year, 9 months to a year.
Do you have a title for it yet?
My title is it's very rough. It's called "The Lifeblood of the Confederate War Machine." George Washington Reigns, the Augusta Powder Works, and the failures of the Union High Command.
Well, we're going to look forward to it.
And the Battle of Ball's Bluff.
Thank you.
So Reigns after the war, Reigns, you know, I know I suffer from biographer's bias, and I fight it all the time. But Reigns was a true genius. I mean, the guy was a genius. He ends up teaching medical college. He is used as an expert witness in murder cases to figure out poisons and different kinds of things, which I didn't know. I read it in some newspapers a short time ago. So he taught in the medical college for a couple of decades in Augusta. He didn't go back to his home state, North Carolina, and he didn't go back north because Homer was still alive. His wife would go back every year. His daughter went back, and she finally moved back when she was about 14 and stayed in the north. So he didn't see her a lot when she was older. And of course, she died at 23 or so. Reigns finally retired, and his wife was getting a little ill, and they went back north. Homer was dead, and they went back and they lived in Newburgh for the last 8 or so years of Reigns's life. Here's what's really interesting to me too. I love family dynamics. His wife had a brother who was an officer in the Orange Blossoms regiments. I think it's 118th Pennsylvania. He was badly wounded at Gettysburg with the powder George made. And they would sit around and have dinner around the table. I wonder what their conversations entailed, right? Reigns died in 1898. His wife died in 1917. And when Reigns died, he left Civil War diaries, and they've never been found. And his letters are beautiful. His handwriting's beautiful. He's the most interesting, perceptive, intelligent guy. And he left Civil War diaries, and damn if I can't find them. And I have looked everywhere, and I just can't find them. But what I did do just recently is I found a picture of his daughter, Fanny. And I just happened to find it, and it was misfiled in a little teeny museum in Newburgh, and it was found up there, and I have a beautiful copy of it. And it was right before she died because she looks to be in her early 20s when it was taken. So that's cool. There's no picture of Frances Ramsdell, Reigns' wife. There are no pictures of her, and she's from a rich family. Where are they? We're looking. There are no letters yet. We don't know where those letters are. There are no pictures of the family together. So it's a strange thing.
There's no survivors of the family to date?
Yeah, there are. There's several different lines, and I really kick myself. one of the descendants of Francis's sister. So it would be her great granddaughter or granddaughter. I was corresponding with her, Ruth Holden, a lot. And she sent me, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, and she sent me some information they had, and she sent me a book that one of the daughters wrote, a recollection of Fanny. That's how I know a lot about Fanny, personality-wise, because I've got about a 20-page recollection of her. And she was very artsy and music-wise, and she was never healthy. She was never a healthy child. And so she sent me a lot of stuff, and she had a lot of family insights, and she said, I know there are letters. I'm looking for them. I saw some of them. I saw the first letter Francis ever wrote to George. I've got that letter, and I need to send it to you, and I need to find it. And then she died. And I keep writing to family survivors, and I can't. None of them will answer.
That's sad.
Yeah. So they're around, but I haven't given up yet.
Well, Ted, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I think you've got.
Yeah. Michael, can I answer one question somebody wrote? Michelle Zach wrote, was he a slave-holding family? This is really quickly, and I know it's getting late. When he was raised in Newburgh, his dad had indentured servants, and they had 2 young slaves, which is very odd. They lived in the city. They were a middle-class kind of family. I thought that was interesting. I only know that because they were on the census, the 1830 and 1840 census. Then what's interesting is when Raines went north and worked in Newburgh, he was there for 5 years. I think his views of things changed a little bit. He came south because his state seceded, and they looked at the country a little bit differently than we do today. Their states were much more important in their outlook on life. But the newspaper in Savannah or Charleston, I don't remember which one, they thought he was a spy. Remember that? Well, they wrote about that, and they said, here's this northern industrialist. So they knew who he was, and a known abolitionist.
Huh.
So he might have adopted his father-in-law's views. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, Raines never talked about slavery. He never owned slaves during the war. So that stuff just never came out. I don't have any other information other than that.
Thank you.
I hope that helped answer your question, Michelle.
What was his rank in the war?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I skipped past that. He started as a major. He ended up becoming a colonel toward the end of the war, last year of the war. There are some sources that say that he was nominated to be a brigadier general, and it just wasn't confirmed in time because the war ended. Raines writes about that, and many people call him a general, and I've got a couple letters from him that say, I heard I was promoted at the end of the war, but I never got notice of that, and so I don't know. And he only signed everything before and after as colonel. He never signed anything as a general.
Huh. Wow.
Ted, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it.
My title suggestion for your book is How the North Unnecessarily Extended the Civil War for Years.
It's true. It's shocking when I got this memorandum from Raines. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share these amazing insights. And I agree with you. It gives you a completely new look on the Civil War. And
I'm sorry, Michael. One more quick thing. I want all of you to think of one thing. When you read about the Civil War from now on, you know about Augusta. When you read about it, think about what the writers are talking about. They're skipping past all the logistics. Think about the lack of activity in the North when all they had to do is fight and lose and win. Fight, lose, they win the war. It's wild. And so think about that when you start assessing policy, because we need to have a different kind of conversation going forward about Northern policy, because something's really off and it needs to be discussed.
Well, thank you so much. And I will tell everyone next month, right now we have tentatively scheduled Thomas Jefferson to be speaking on slavery in America. We have a number of great speakers lined up. I can't promise they'll be as good as Ted, but they'll be good. And so once again, thank you so much, Ted, and hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
My pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Thank
staying.
you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Great,
you.
great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, just send them. I'll be happy to answer them.
Oh, great.
We got it. Thank you.
Thank you.